Welcome to Fearless Females, where ambition meets resilience. Meet your guide, Lorie Jones, owner of Fearless Financial Advisors. Join her and remarkable women executives as they uncover the triumphs and transformative moments shaping extraordinary careers. Ready to be fearless? Let the journey begin.
Good morning, Fearless Females. Thank you so much for joining us today. I always love these interviews. They're so exciting. And for me, they just fill my bucket. So let's get started. I'd like to thank my sponsor, Fearless Financial Advisors, fearlessly sponsoring Fearless Females. So I'm so excited about that. So our guest today is Natalie Levy. And when Natalie first walked into the world of finance, she was told quite literally, women don't do this. But instead of backing down, she basically built her own seat at the table and pulled other women along with her. In this episode, Natalie shares her journey from being one of the only women in the derivatives trading on Wall Street to founding She's Independent, which was an angel investment group that's basically rewriting the rules of who gets to make the money moves. What I loved most about Natalie is that she doesn't just talk about changing the system. She is the change. She's honest. She's got a little bit of humor and a whole lot of heart, but she kind of walks us through what it means to build your voice and to trust your gut and to step into spaces where you aren't always welcome. So if you've ever felt like you didn't quite belong or question whether you could lead in your own authentic way, this one's for you. Let's get started. So today we're here with Natalie Levy. She is the founder and managing partner of She's Independent. And I've just had a minute or two to kind of get to know Natalie, and I'm so excited for you guys to hear her story. I can hardly wait. In fact, I said afterwards, just stay around for a minute so I can ask all the questions that are bubbling up. So Natalie, thank you so much for joining us today.
And thanks so much for having me. Excited to be here.
So the first question that I always ask is my very favorite, honestly. It's, what is your favorite book?
Great. So this is the only question I looked at just briefly a minute ago. And I don't have one. So I'm going to quickly mention a few or several.
Okay, two or three. Like, oh yeah.
I'm a big reader. Okay. So I'll just do a few. And I think for the nature of this conversation, one, The Soul of Money, which I feel like you would appreciate if you don't know it.
I don't. And I love that idea.
I'm also going to mention 10% Happier. And I read that years ago, but my first kind of introduction into kind of mindfulness and meditation. And then this is a fun one. And here we are, two women. I'm going to say Come As You Are. So there you go. It's basically a sex book, but yeah, it's all about the women. So those are a few. Of course, I could mention others. I'm going to stop right there.
All right. Well, I love it. I love that you love reading as much as I do. And I haven't read any of those three, so they get added to my list, but my stack is about that big so far.
Got it.
So tell me a little bit about your journey. Natalie, how did you get started? How did you get where you're at now? Kind of what do you do now? This is sort of the who you are and what you do portion.
Yeah, my dog's excited, so she's going to start barking in the background. She loves this question. She's part of the journey, of course. So I would say, from a young age, I was, in advanced math classes. I went to engineering school, went to Wall Street, and a lot of my story was, fighting to get in the rooms, whether it was myself fighting or my mom fighting to get me in. And it was, I want to do this, and some pushback. Oh, women don't do this. And even from my, Wall Street days, which I know life and, the world is supposed to change. But when I graduated full-time in 2006, the HR team said, no, derivatives traders, we don't really have women in that department. So why don't you try sales? But I became a derivatives trader. And so the story again and again, whether it was harassment, me too, I continued to do the hard thing. Mm-hmm. And I spent years in finance and numerous financial roles, left kicking and screaming, but ultimately have now gotten back into it in a really rewarding way. Never thought I wanted to again. And, my finance days span all different types of, roles, from institutional finance, derivatives trading on Wall Street, to private equity out in San Francisco, and also angel investing for more than a decade myself. But when I left those environments, I said, nope, I'm done. And the reason I'm doing it again and the reason I'm back is a number of women who heard about my investment track record had interest and, wanted to partake. And for me to be able to step into impact that marries my skills and, my successes and say, I can bring you with me and you can learn these things and you can become, whether it's a bit of an expert or, step into a portfolio, it's something that's really rewarding. And so today I run a women first angel investment group. Women first, meaning we love investing in women and we recognize the gaps of funding flows. And, there are not enough women who are allocating capital. And so we very much work with mentor support, educate, getting more women and diverse folks into angel investing. And so that's the very quick and dirty of where I am.
So you said, I left finance and said I was never coming back. Why did you leave finance? It's so much fun here.
Oh gosh, yeah, I can see and feel and taste the irony. From my earliest days, I was mesmerized by the money and the influence, that were Wall Street circa 2006 in Manhattan. But just so many awkward, uncomfortable, and, harassing moments throughout my career, especially my young career, but just uncomfortable cultures and lack of mentorship and sponsorship. I mean, really kind of garbage. And also, sales and trading, for anyone who doesn't know what it is, it's exciting and highly energetic, but it takes a lot. And if you do it for a period of time, you're not really building a career in anything else. It's kind of like you learn how to do that, but it's not necessarily fully transferable skills. And so I did that for 5 years. And at some point you kind of wake up and say, well, this isn't making me happy. Maybe it's making me sick. I look around, I don't see others that are happy. I don't see women that are, good role models. And when you recognize you need to make a change, you absolutely do. And so that was probably the first time I really started listening to kind of, gut. But yeah, I mean, the Me Too moments, nonstop. So a lot of just inappropriate behavior and this and that. And also just not feeling like, a sense of belonging in those cultures and in those rooms. So again, fun and, yeah, you can make a lot of money, but it just felt like a fight. And, the same thing ended up happening less with the Me Too moments, in private equity. But again, I didn't feel like I was getting the growth or the support that I needed to be a professional and, get bigger in my role. And so yeah, I kind of ran, multiple times or got, I should say pushed out the second time, but really glad that I didn't spend more time in the strictly financial, fields.
Yeah, it's so interesting because, one of my passions is bringing more women into finance. And I know that there are a lot of times, back in the day when you were the only woman in the room. And it seems like in that Wall Street kind of trading sort of, that era, you kind of still are the only woman in the room. Like I always say we have about 20% female advisors and we've had 20% for 20 years, but I don't think those are the numbers when you're getting into the derivatives trading. I think you really are.
And, you might have 50% women in the analyst class incoming, but, 5 years in, you're one of very few existing. And by the way, if we're not allowed to show up authentically as ourselves or don't know how to because we'd be pushed out, you look around and even if there are women, it doesn't feel like there are women, because you don't really have a voice.
That's so interesting. I that's one of the things that, in my space that I work really hard to try and make a space for women so they feel, I love the idea of, they belong here or they feel like there's a place for them here. And I find it sad that you didn't have that experience still in 2019, 2020.
Well, what's nuts is now it's 2024 and I, have recently connected with some women who were at the bank I was at and they more recently had, the similar or same experiences, even as managing directors. And so forget that I was analyst associate, you're younger and not that should be a write-off, but women who become managing directors are still dealing with it today. It's
Yeah.
like, no matter what we do and we accomplish, it's the same story. And, I think an organization that's really, really large or has operated the same way or has, antiquated styles of, I don't know, communications and, old embedded culture, that's not going to change unless somebody steps into those most senior roles and, partners and say, this is absolutely, going to change. And that just doesn't happen.
Yeah. Well, and hopefully this idea of, getting more women on boards, more women in the C-suite, more women in these areas may start to see some of that change in the future. But yeah, I do find it disheartening that even today, it's
and I think,
still,
women on the board as a topic, because that's how we connected, one woman on the board, that's just one woman. Two women, three women, when you start to change the numbers, and even before parity, but when you start to change the numbers, then things change. But you can't be the only woman. You can't be middle management and say, hey, this needs to change, because you get managed out. HR isn't there to protect you and change culture. And so if you can't get buy-in, from the most senior folks, or if you don't have multiple voices saying this needs to change, by the way, allyship is huge. So I'm not saying one woman on the board doesn't change things, but I've heard it again and again. It's tough if the numbers aren't in your favor.
Yeah, we need more voices. I love that. So let's delve into just a little bit about your journey, Natalie. As you've gone through your professional experience, is there something that you can say, oh my gosh, I'm so glad that I made that investment? Like that particular thing that I did was so pivotal to where I'm showing up today.
Yeah, I think this started when I was younger, and I think I got a lot of it from my mom.
Mm-hmm.
But just developing my voice and the I can mentality, I learned only in the last year that I was neurodiverse. Women present differently, and there's many reasons for it. But I've always been okay with discomfort, and I've been okay with kind of pushback. And I've still found a way to say, I can exist, I can do this, and that's something that I don't think a lot of women and a lot of folks have necessarily, or I should say, folks that don't look like the leadership team. And so having my voice, at the end of the day has allowed me to say, wait, this isn't appropriate. Even though I went to HR and I didn't realize, they're there to protect the bank, for example, being able to speak up and say, this is unreasonable, this is inappropriate, this is not fair, make a change and walk away from a company when, something is off. Being able to say, well, sure, I don't have that MBA, but I am absolutely qualified for this role, knowing my value.
Mm-hmm.
Because otherwise, if I just listen to people, then I wouldn't be sitting here in such a position of strength and doing all these things and grown, and developed so much self-awareness. I would have been, not that there's anything wrong with being married, but I would have been probably married off and, crying in a room full of tears because I never really figured out who I was and what I wanted. But to have developed resilience and strength and to have found such a meaningful path that, by the way, honors, I didn't mention this before, but we've lost several family members to suicide. I'm able to bring them with me. I'm able to honor them and myself. It's a really, beautiful and powerful thing.
Is there some way that you invested in finding that voice, or was it just natural? Like, is there a checklist you can give the rest of us to find the voice?
It's a great point. I think being neurodiverse, so neurodiverse can mean a number of things in terms of, how you present. I'm autistic and HSP. It means highly sensitive person, which is probably a form of autism. But I've always been a bit in my head, whether you want to call it introspective, feeling different. But I think sitting with myself, which is something you learn about in, mindfulness practices, and befriending the voice in your head and saying, what do I need? And not just showing up because, oh my gosh, you're single and you need to go out because it's Friday or Saturday night, but I care about health and I want to cuddle my dog and read a book at, 8 p.m. on a Saturday after acupuncture and a massage. I mean, do what serves you, right? And I think trying the things and recognizing what doesn't, and recognizing what are projections or other people's expectations and values versus, understanding your own is huge. And so you could even call part of it, a journey in understanding feminism, right? It took me probably until my 30s of digging into, well, what is really my voice and what do I want versus how I was raised and what I was told and, people's judgment. But the more you can unpack that, and by the way, when you go through really tough events, that can also further speed up that cycle.
Yeah.
And I think there's meditation practices and different ways to kind of find that self-awareness. But yeah, for me, I've always had that unique thing, and I'm going to call it a good characteristic, right? That kind of autism piece, which for many years, I'm sure I kind of hated it, but it allowed me to have a voice and be okay with discomfort. But I think flexing that and, like any muscle, recognizing, wait, I'm good at negotiating. I'm good at pushing back. I'm good at, establishing these things and leaning into that. And then the self-awareness and the growth from life and lived experiences and being introspective on that, it all just further elevated that mix of the gut instinct of what are good decisions and what are my values. And then, how do I want to show up? And when do I want to speak up?
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I know this is a little out of scope. I'm going to give one more example, which is,
okay,
and it'll give you a little bit of an idea of my waking life. But I've been going to the bathhouse a lot for sauna and cold plunge. And I had a conversation with two different psychologists there because you meet a bunch of really interesting people. And I was saying that, sometimes after a first date, I'm very honest and, these men will blow up and be really nasty if you say you're not interested. And one of the psychologists said, you don't know them honesty. I only give my close friends honesty. But then the other psychologist who was a lot more grounded, let's just say he dealt with his personal trauma and he was married with a family. And because he was in relationship psychology, he goes, actually, he said, show up like you want to show up, show up truthful if you are a truthful person. And it was so interesting because those conversations didn't happen in the same room, the same sauna, I should say. But I had time to reflect and I continue showing up with truth, with my truth. And even though it's hard and some people are total assholes, I still am honest because that's who I am at my core. And to recognize my value and to feel good about that, even if it can get you in some, hot water, I want to influence the world positively. And I choose how much energy I bring with that. But I don't want to lie and, create an environment that makes it safer for somebody else, but not for other women. I'd rather speak with the truth.
That's so interesting. I like that idea of like you show up the way that feels more authentic to you or that feels right to you. I think that, I've been given advice to, figure out what your strengths are and then kind of lean into those strengths. Cause I am really analytical and I'm less empathetic, more analytical. And so I do have to kind of lean into that strength and let my strengths kind of overcome some of my weaknesses. And I like that idea of like showing up authentically you and being and telling your truth, not hiding.
It's interesting because I think definitely lean into strengths and find roles, positions, relationships, all that, showcase strengths. But I would add that by building on some of the areas of weakness, we can find so much more balance and fulfillment ultimately. And so it's like, I wouldn't lean out from weaknesses, but I'd make sure that like with our waking, day job and where we're spending a lot of time, it is things that we enjoy that we're also good at. But I do think that, to your point of being analytical and maybe less on the, EQ side, like that's how I used to be. And then I've gone through a bunch. And so I've furthered that muscle on EQ and I saw how others showed up. So I've developed that and I'm really glad that I leaned in to learn more there.
That's interesting because there's a great debate going around about whether or not you minimize the weaknesses or whether you try and strengthen them because they're never going to be your strengths. And it sounds like you come on the side of strengthen them because it makes you more well-rounded. Is that right?
I think it's strengthened them enough. And I'm not saying it flips. I'm not saying our personalities completely, 180, but it's really been rewarding for me. And also, like, I'll give you the example of I'm a type A woman who, if I was just alpha all the time, like that wouldn't make me happy. It makes me sick. And by finding a place where I can also soften, it's allowed me to show up in ways that are much more enjoyable and attract a different type of individual. And so I've really enjoyed that work of recognizing the strengths and showing up in certain ways. If I need to be a New York asshole, I will. But coming from a place of, content and fulfillment and not just being type A. And overall, it feels really great. And I operate with a much healthier, better energy and less volatility.
That's interesting. I like that idea. I like the idea of, I've never really liked the idea of completely ignoring your weaknesses.
Yeah.
So that's been difficult for me to get behind, but I do
Right.
like the idea of maybe that makes you more a holistic person or a more balanced.
Yeah. And determine how you want to show up. And one other thing, just quickly on the topic, it took me until about the age of 30 to hear direct feedback that this is what you're great at. This is what you should be doing. So again, like, I don't want to shy away from what are you great at? Not just what do you think, but what do other people say you're great at?
Mm-hmm.
So again, that's powerful to know.
Yeah.
And that's different than what skills do you want to work on for your personal life and how you show up outside of work, right? And again, I think this also is, if we're the authentic person, like, you shouldn't show up totally differently maybe in the office, and you can still, talk about those different skills. I love that my interpersonal skills and my empathy and, all of that allows me to show up stronger, I think, at work, even though I'm still a type A nature by background. But yeah, it's something I've really enjoyed developing.
What is the worst advice that someone gave you? And did you take it? Did you not take it?
I mean, it goes back to the days of she's a woman or she's a girl. And I don't know if it's advice versus judgment, but I'll give you a few examples. When I went to women in engineering camp, and one of the camp counselors said, to me, "Oh, are you, going to engineering school for your MRS, AKA like to get married, your missus?" Because I made jokes. And yes, like, being boy crazy when you're a teenager, like, okay, so sue me. Really, she was, I'm sure, just jealous. But, on the Wall Street front, it was, "Oh, you should be my side piece. You should be my girlfriend. When are you going to get married?" And again, it's that projection and that judgment that if I'd listened to them and that had shaped my path versus me making the decision, that would have been really upsetting. And again, like, my actual path, which was probably fighting all of that and saying, I'm going to do it no matter what, also probably wasn't the best, most healthy, place to be. But I think just waking up one day and saying, okay, I'm going to do what I need to do for me. I'm really thankful I got there. And I didn't wait until, near retirement or some really bad life event.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's interesting. The MRS degree is still a thing, huh?
I mean, it apparently so. And that woman should not be a camp counselor for young engineering-minded women.
Yeah. What about regrets? Is there something you can look back on in your journey and say, ooh, if I knew then the same things I know now, like I think that if you go through knowing the exact same things that you would have known then, you probably do it the same. But what if you had today's experience and knowledge behind you? Is there an experience or a situation that you would go back and do differently, and how and why?
I think if I could give myself advice to my younger self, it would really be about digging into the, what do I want? What are my values? What do I really want to do apart from the societal pressures and standards and projections and, what parents tell you?
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to be an artist when I was younger. And my parents, who were scientists, didn't think that was practical. And it was, you should do something that, makes a financial living. And, hey, I went to Wall Street. And if I did it again, and if I did it my own way, maybe I would have started being an artist and done something else. Or maybe I would have decided I don't want to be an artist. But what I don't like is that they made the decision for me. Mm-hmm. And I think if you can be aligned with your, values and goals or whatever that looks like, and they can change, but the sooner you can find your voice, mm-hmm. I think you can live better and more fully and, make better decisions for yourself. And so for me, that's, I guess, kind of a regret that it took so long. I'll also use that on the dating front, which is, I probably dated too often these kind of beta or softer types that didn't really challenge me. And, at the end of the day, I wouldn't do that again. The question is, right, are you learning from all these situations and relationships? And to stop repeating a pattern, right? You have to change something within yourself that I believe now I've done. And I really think now that I reflect on all that I've been through in these suicide losses and life, I think that being single mostly in my life and, not having been married, it's allowed me to grow in really beautiful ways. And so I'm not mad about it. But yeah, I think I'd probably have a different path and journey. But hey, who knows? Maybe I would end up exactly in the same place.
Yeah.
Which is not a bad thing.
Uh-huh. Well, what if you could go back and talk to yourself at 20 years old, just at the start of your journey? Maybe not 20, but like just when you're starting out on this journey. Is there something you'd want to tell her?
Yeah, I think I'd want to tell her that, the world throws things at you and you go through tough things and it's growth. And that finding your voice and finding your path, you want to find what's right for you. And you don't just listen to people. You do want, mentorship and sponsorship where it's aligned.
Mm-hmm.
But you want to try and create and fail and grow and not be scared of, the pivot and doing new things. I think that, the most fantastic inventions or, startups or launches or growth, come from that, taking the skills and applying them elsewhere. Mm-hmm. And trying things and failing, right? And trying and failing. And so I think, don't be super risk averse and don't think that, that 401k plan when you're, in your 20s is the biggest thing. Sure, we know how, money compounds and it's great to have that 401k match, but, you don't need the corporate job if you want to try something else. Mm-hmm. I'd probably, try some startups and, some other things, because at the end of the day, if you are going to work hard and if you want to learn and grow, the growth isn't going to happen because you're doing the same thing day in, day out. And if you don't listen to or establish, what's that voice and what are your values, how are you going to find your North Star?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How will you know? Is there a way, because I know that when you're young, sometimes it's super hard to know what is anxiety, what is your voice inside of you telling you what's right for you. Should I listen to other people? Like, when do I listen to somebody else giving me advice and that's going to be the best idea that I ever had? And when do I not listen to them? Like, is there a test for figuring out what's...
All right. So I am by no means an expert in this, but I'll give you an example, which is a concept called the muscle test.
Okay.
And again, like, I'm not an energy healer or energy worker, but it's an interesting thing where basically you can learn how to sit with something or meditate on something and then say, how do I respond? How does my body respond? Mm-hmm. So maybe it's a physical way to think about like gut instinct.
Okay.
But I think just the more time you spend with yourself, and I'm not talking about a meditation app per se, even though that might be the start of the journey. I'm not talking about a yoga class where you're just moving and trying to busy your mind, but sitting with yourself and maybe breathing or watching your thoughts kind of, from outside of your body in a way and letting thoughts pass and recognizing what judgment is and recognizing what feels good and, meditating with things. And you can, there's so much you can read out there and practice in terms of mindfulness, but, quieting your mind. And again, the more time you can spend with yourself, even if it's 2 minutes a day or, 10 minutes a day, to be able to say, this feels good. Like, this actually feels good. And people have different forms of it, journaling, whatever you want to do.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that if you can figure out, what actually feels good versus what did my therapist tell me or what did my mom or my sister tell me, that's a beautiful thing because everybody has their own lived experience. Everyone has their own body. And there's so much that you can unlock by really listening to yourself. And even tarot cards is an example, right? It's like, ask questions and that just the interpretation of it can start a conversation with yourself or with your friends.
Yeah.
But just, lean into it, and it could feel awkward and uncomfortable at first, but I guarantee you, if you show up for it and you're looking for something, I'm not saying like you will immediately find meaning, but you're going to find something to learn from.
Yeah, that's really an interesting idea. I never thought about, you have those games like Get to Know You games or the, Get to Know Yourself or Self-Discovery Pact. Like, what if you did that with yourself? Like, what if you asked yourself those questions? That's a really interesting idea. I like that.
The other thing I want to say is, so for our investment group as an example, I have women all the time ask, how do I change my mindset?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm gonna use kind of a metaphor on this one, but the thing I say to them is, you're never going to be 100% confident and ready to allocate or write your first angel check. But when you do the thing, it changes your mind. And so similarly, right? Like, you may not feel like a meditator or somebody who's into mindfulness, but if you want to find that power or work on that muscle, do the thing, and then your mindset will change, And so don't just go with the, oh, you know what, I was raised this way or that way, if you never ask the questions and you never try to show up, what are you leaving on the table really? And so again, the more lived experience we have, the tough things we go through, right? Like, that can all help develop the, what is really the thing. And by the way, like, an exercise you could do with a friend. I've never suggested this, but I will. I don't know if you've ever been interviewed by, somebody who's just phenomenal at interviewing, right? They're usually like a genius, or they're just really good with people, but they'll keep peeling back the layers of that onion with you. And it's, why do you want to do this? Oh, why do you care about the money? But why, what's the power behind that? And the more you dig into the whys, right? Not just that first question, the more you can learn about really what's driving that person. And so if it's too hard to do it yourself, do it with somebody else. But peel back the layers, right? Don't just on the surface say, well, yeah, I want to make a bunch of money. It's like, okay, well, why? And then why? And then why? And it's, when you get to that core thing, you learn so much more about the, what's driving you or what you need or your goal. And hopefully, you can learn something through that.
Yeah, I like that. I love that idea. What scared you the most when you started on your journey, Natalie? And does it still scare you or not?
Gosh, I don't know what scared me the most, because I did a lot of scary things. Like, even in school, I'd show up and be the only woman doing this, or, I'd be in a grad class and I'd be the only undergrad and I'd blah, blah, blah. I think I'm going to move it to something else, which maybe is an uncomfortable topic, but I'm going to say the thing that scared me the most in life was losing my mom to suicide. And just that experience of, it was a slow motion horror film, and just recognizing what happened and saying, wow, we can't rewind, and this happened. How do you process it? And now I feel like an orphan, or whatever you want to, like, I've lost my mom, which is such a pivotal relationship to so many of us as women. And I'm like, am I ever going to recover? And, what's going to happen now? And I think it was like before that event and after that event. And I would never wish anything like that on anyone, but I'm really thankful that I processed it and dealt with it the way that I did. And I'd already invested in things like mindfulness and meditative practices and health tools, all these things, because to have found some type of footing, not steady footing, but some type of support, had a network of amazing women and community, family that I was born with, family that became family over time, to be able to show up for myself, all these things. It didn't happen immediately. It was things that I'd invested in over the years. I'm so glad that I showed up the way that I did in life, so that I was able to navigate that. And this sounds crazy to say, I've improved my relationship with my mother since her death, since the loss. That's the work that I continue to do. And the way that I operate this investment group, she's independent. I bring my cousin Z that we lost. I bring, my mom's cousin Carol Dorfman that we lost. And it's amazing, because it's not just about giving. It's also honoring, I think, myself and other women, but it's just a beautiful thing that feels so powerful. It's bigger than me. So I'm really thankful to show up the way I do, and also to have shown up the way that I did going into that, so that I could handle it.
Yeah, I'm really sorry. I know that that's a really traumatic experience, to lose a mother especially, but to lose a loved one in your life is really difficult. And I can see that some of the work that you did beforehand, because when you get to those kinds of experiences, those pivotal experiences, sometimes it's simplistic to say, but there's like binary paths. You can let it make you, or you can let it break you, right? And the what you had put into where you were when you reached that pivotal point allowed you to go down the make you path to help it enrich your life, even though terrible.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the skills that we can learn and the new sense of spirituality that I started to show up with. I mean, when we lost my cousin a year after my mom, and he was 17 at the time, looked up to me so much in this world, I was already feeling spiritual connection to him within a week of his passing. It just sounds insane to say that. But it took about 6 months to find, some semblance of peace. Not that I was over it by any means, but, after my mom, but within a week to start feeling, it was a different relationship, but you start building on these skills. By the way, if anyone's dealing with, a traumatic event and processing, there are phenomenal modalities out there for immediate processing, things like tapping, there's somatic awareness, there's breath work, there's all these beautiful things. But to build on these skills, I do feel like I have such a resilient mindset. And let me explain one other thing, which is more recently in the last 6 months, I had a really, really difficult physical issue. I had a bad ski accident that ended up being 2 surgeries and 10 and a half days in the hospital.
Oh my gosh.
And the orthopedics team wouldn't believe me when I told them how much pain I was in. And they said it was a mental health issue and it was my fault that I was in the pain. And let's all roll our eyes there for a second. And after my sister advocated for 4 days with the hospitalist, meaning the hospital, and they got an x-ray, the x-ray showed there was a complication. And the ortho team, after every day telling me I needed to leave the hospital, then said, oh, we're sorry, there was a complication with the surgery. You need another operation. By the way, going into Memorial Day weekend, so wait another 3.5 days. I've always had a voice. And even when I was on all the drugs, and I said, you can't talk to me like that. And you have to respect the fact that I am telling you, what I'm living. And I actually fired the physician's assistant who said these very inappropriate things. By the way, showed up very differently when my boyfriend at the time stepped in the room because, hey, there's a witness. I mean, they just try to retell the story the way they want. And as women and, folks that don't get represented by, the leadership team or whatever you want to call it, our voices matter. And just because there's inherent bias and, gaps, and I'm not necessarily paying their bills, but maybe I am, don't let that impact you showing up. And don't let that stop you from, showing up for yourself and also for those that don't have voices.
Yeah. I think that's an important piece too. Like sometimes what we do in the experiences that we go through and the advocate, we're advocating for those who are quieter. Maybe they haven't found their voice yet, or maybe they're just naturally don't have that voice.
It is the election today. So I'm just going to quickly say, I read some Instagram posts from a woman who posted about not voting and basically said, everybody has a right and I'm not going to vote and blah, blah, blah. And in the comments, a lot of people called her out because that is a position of privilege that you can vote and you're choosing not to. And think how many people can't have their voices heard. And I think it's such an important one to recognize. No one's perfect and no candidate is perfect. But if you actually self-educate yourself and, you don't just listen to the damn political parties, but you say, well, what do I need being a woman or being a Black woman or being, somebody in this minority group, not just listening to the marketing, right? But you really dig into some of this stuff. How do you not vote? And I know our democracy is broken and the political parties, everything's a mess, but it kind of stuck with me because it's like, just because you're in a position of privilege where maybe your life isn't in danger, like what about the others?
I agree 100%. We have the opportunity and the privilege of voting, and we should definitely do it. Natalie, tell me, did you face any unique challenges because you were a woman?
So many challenges as a woman. From my, early career days, my even young childhood days of, being in advanced math, the stories I could tell you, I mean, they're endless. I'll give you just some examples. 2nd grade, Miss Skelly, I'm calling her out. She made the girls play with their hair during story time. I said no. By the way, she'd be arrested today. And she told my mom I needed to be in remedial class. I thought I learned differently. And so we did ultimately get me a tutor. By the way, when my, teachers complained to my mom that I was being disruptive or, didn't belong in a certain class, it's because I needed to be in, 3-4 advanced classes beyond, right, in terms of mathematics. And so it was this weird thing of like, I didn't just want to sit there quietly, and that maybe wasn't normal being a woman or a young girl. And so it was kind of fighting to get into the thing that I needed, being a girl, being a woman that, typically was all men, but also not keeping my mouth quiet or shut was also something that, we had to advocate or navigate, I should say. So I think the story repeats itself. There was a lot of, she's tough, she's combative, but you're not hearing me, right? Ortho team, I'm in pain. You're not hearing me. And I think maybe another thing that we didn't touch on before around lessons, but using your voice, but not necessarily having to scream it, which hopefully you learn at some point, and there's more strategic and, smarter ways to kind of get to that, which you could make somebody believe that or manipulate them into something, which I don't want to do. But the point is, if you don't hear me, maybe there's a different way I need to speak up, right?
Yeah, maybe a different. Yeah. And there are a lot of ways out there that you can kind of lean into strengths or one way of communicating here and another way of communicating here. I just think that you need to make sure and be authentic and real.
Yeah. Let me also suggest one other. Well, I know I'm not supposed to say another book. I'm going to say it. Word slut, one word. Think feminism meets linguistics. And what I think so great, I love Amanda Montell who writes it. The idea that we don't have to show up as men, and there are, really powerful things in terms of even word choice as women. Let me give you an example. We say like more. We're better with the interpersonal, making somebody else feel comfortable or, bridging the conversation. And so some of these, influencers or, people out there saying, well, this is how to show up like men. I don't want to show up like a man. I want to know what works for the men, and I want to know when I should tiptoe around that. But showing up like a woman and being strong in that positioning and maybe sometimes softening because that works for women, that's really powerful.
Yeah. I like that idea. Natalie, what are you most proud of?
I think I'm the most proud of the growth and how I show up today. And I'm going to marry that to what I do with She's Independent Investments. It's brilliant. It feels so aligned. It's influential. It's, bringing others along the journey, and it's honoring family members that, can't be here in this living world with us today, but I know how proud they are.
Yeah, you can feel that. Thank you so much, Natalie, for your time. If there is a young lady and she is just starting down on this path that you're successful at and you've navigated so beautifully so far, what advice would you give?
My dog wants to give her a lot of advice. If you hear,
I can tell. Wow. Your dog is ready with the answer to this question.
She's ready. But her advice isn't always great. It's basically usually talking about food or squirrels.
That was probably the squirrel right there.
I think it's recognizing, what is feminism? What are your values? How do you show up in this world? What do you want to do? Why do you want to do it? I do think money is influential and impactful. And so when I spoke to a room full of 300 young sorority women the other day at CU or the other month, and none of them raised their hand when I said, who's thinking about finance? And I explained what angel investing was and investing and the power. And then I asked again, who's interested now? And a bunch of hands went up. I think it's put yourself out there and learn things that are maybe outside your comfort zone, but start learning, from a young age and try things. And recognizing, even if somebody doesn't want to learn the things around money, and this is advice for everyone, know the fundamentals, know the basics, right? So you're not taken advantage of. You and I chatted about that a little bit before this kicked off. But yeah, I think the biggest one is know yourself and then act accordingly.
I love that. Great advice. Thank you so much, Natalie, for spending the time with us and sharing your journey and sharing a lot of these ideas that you've come up with. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. I know you and I will continue talking about all the things, but thanks for the work you do as well. I think what I do, what you do, different areas of wealth and money, and it's all really important stuff.
Yeah, it is. Super important. Underpins your life. What if I have a young lady who's listening to this and she wants to get in touch with you and ask a question or needs some advice? Is there some way that she can get in touch with you?
Absolutely. And she doesn't need to be a young woman. She can also be a young man. We have people of all different ages that invest with us or learn with us. Our website is she'sindependent.com. On Instagram, it's at she'sindependent_. And I'm reachable both those places. And we do, regular events that include education. We have mentorship kind of baked into, how we operate. And so, hey, we have capacity. Hope to meet some more folks there.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Lorie.